On February 15th, 2017, around noon, the police received a call reporting a murder of a young woman in her apartment. The call was placed by the victim's neighbor. Upon arriving to the crime scene, the victim, identified as Lily Paddington, was found face down on her living room floor with 3 stab wounds to her midsection. There was no sign of forced entry, and everything in the house was accounted for.
Because Lily's wounds were in her back, we know she was not facing her assailant. Because there was no forced entry, we can determine that Lily knew her murderer. This left us with few suspects. After interviewing Lily's colleagues and family, we came to 3 suspects: Lily's half-brother, Chris Anthem, Lily's girlfriend, Ida Crook, and Lily's boyfriend, Robin Banks. When the body was found, it was necessary to determine if there were any substances in the victim's body. To determine if there were any substances in Lily Paddington's body, we used nuclear magnetic resonance spectrophotometry, also known as NMR. NMR makes the material radioactive and analyzes the emission of gamma rays to determine the content of the sample. Through NMR, we found that the victim had arsenic poisoning in her body. Arsenic is a common poison because of its reactivity. Arsenic is very reactive. Because of its position in the periodic table, arsenic is very similar to phosphorus in regard to its chemical properties. Due to this, in any biological processes that involve phosphorus, arsenic is toxic in them. We can conclude that the person who murdered Lily had access to arsenic poisoning and had the ability to put the poison in a drink of hers or in her food.
The crime scene had a glass of water on the dining room table. To test whether or not the water had traces of poison in it, a process called high-pressure liquid chromatography was used. HPLC is a variation of column chromatography, in which the liquid sample was pumped through a column with chromatographic packing material from a solvent reservoir in which the sample was placed. The sample was carried by a current stream of helium gas through a tube lined with silica gel, which is highly hydrophobic. Due to the different levels of hydrophobicity of molecules and elements, some molecules traveled through the tube much faster than others and others slower. And the detector at the end of the entire HPLC system graphed the different concentrations of elements in the sample. After comparing the results of the graph with known elemental trends, it was found that only hydrogen and oxygen were present in the sample. Therefore, it was concluded that the poisoning must have taken place elsewhere, for there was no trace of poison in the glass of water.
As the investigation continued, we concluded that Lily Paddington's time of death was earlier than first concluded in the autopsy. The reason for this change is due to arsenic trioxide. Arsenic trioxide has the ability to raise the body's temperature over 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. A human's body temperature is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, but due to arsenic poisoning, Lily's body temperature increased to drastic levels. A dead body loses 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour after the heart has stopped beating, and this stage is known as rigor mortis. The effects of arsenic poisoning had already taken effect once Lily Paddington was stabbed in the back, causing the difference in the time of death.
By analyzing Lily Paddington's blood spatter, we were able to determine that the murderer was injured in the process of stabbing her. We found that there were 2 different spatters. There was one spatter from the victim, which we determined by measuring the drops of spatter to determine the trajectory. The trajectory of these drops of spatters matched to the victim's body. We ignored the backlash spatters from when the assailant pulled the weapon out of Lily's body. However, there was a group of drip stains that did not match up to the victim's body, nor did they match up to the backlash spatters. We can conclude that these drip stains were the assailants and use DNA analysis to determine whose blood it is.
There was a hair sample found at the scene of the crime where the victim was killed, and using the hair sample, given that the root of the hair is included, we can amplify the DNA in the hair in order to determine if any of the suspects we have matches the hair sample. We need the root of the hair because the root contains keratinocytes, which are ideal for the extraction of nuclear DNA. However, other parts of the hair, there's not enough viable DNA there to extract. Once the DNA is extracted from the cell, a process known as polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, is used to multiply the DNA to a point where an entire DNA profile is able to be made. PCR uses a machine called a thermocycler and naturally occurring enzyme to copy a specific stretch of DNA over and over again. Having lost the DNA makes the genetic code easier to analyze. Once there's a large amount of DNA present, a process known as gel electrophoresis is completed. The process uses an enzyme to chop up the DNA into varying sized fragments. The fragments are then placed in small holes on the gel on one side of it, and then the fragments are then exposed to an electric current. Heavy fragments who do not move as far in the gel and get stuck do not move far away from the holes they were put in. However, light fragments move across to the other side of the gel. The result of this process is several bands of varying thickness in different positions along the gel. This result is known as a DNA profile and is compared to the suspect's DNA that we harvested. The hair found on the scene went through this DNA testing process and was found to match the female suspect, Ida Crook.
After interviewing each suspect, Lily's brother had an alibi for the determined time of death, as did Ida. Robin, however, did not have an airtight alibi. After the time of death changed due to the discovered arsenic poisoning, Robin and Curtis had alibis, but Ida did not. Therefore, investigation into Ida's life became priority.
Once the time of death changed and the hair sample found on the scene was determined to be Ida's, Ida underwent investigation and we determined she was the stabber of Lily Paddington. However, we know that Lily was also poisoned, and the time of poisoning was estimated to be earlier that day on February 14th, when we found she was on a date with Robin. We then investigated Robin's apartment and found arsenic thrown into the dumpster of his apartment complex, and that evidence helped prove Robin Banks as the poisoner of Lily Paddington. Lily Paddington was murdered twice, and she was the victim of a fatal love triangle.